I'm here today with Lindsay Golich of the USOC. She's a sports scientist that I've actually been working with for probably close to 10 years. We started using power to help analyze my runs and help adjust some things and just kind of see how everything's flowing. And so I have her today to just talk a little bit about power. I use the Stryds pod and I put it on my shoe every day that I go for a run, and then the data gets uploaded and Lindsay's able to look at it. So Lindsay, could you just tell us a little bit about Stryds and the power that is collected and kind of what that means?
Sure. Yeah, so the Stryds, it's a small foot pod and it attaches to the laces on your shoe. We just measure on one side of the foot rather than 2 feet. And really the goal with the Stryds power meter is that we're collecting power data. So similar to cycling, we're figuring out how much force you're needing to generate yourself to move through your running mechanics. But the nice thing with the Stryds is that we can get a whole lot of other metrics out of it. So we can get some of the simple ones, such as stride rate and ground contact time that we can get often with a lot of our different watches. We can also get some GPS and how far you're running and the time that you're running. But then because we're measuring power, which we use some calculations based upon your height and your leg length and body weight, then we can begin to figure out your leg spring stiffness, so how springy you are off the ground, how long your foot is on the ground for, your vertical power, so how much power is going up versus how much power is going horizontal. And so then the goal with power is that we track it over time and we can measure changes, whether they're positive or negative, or we're trying to maintain something.
Yep, and so like with me, I've gone through an injury, and I think coming back, some of my metrics have changed a little bit, especially right after post-surgery. So could you maybe talk about what are you looking for in a power, like spring stiffness number, ground contact time? Do we want, for me personally and for everyone, like do you want those numbers to be high or low, or what are you kind of looking at?
Yeah, so I would say what's really great about your situation is that you're using the Stryds before your injury. We have a lot of athletes that use these technologies like after injury, so we don't have a good benchmark. So for you, we've got data from before, and then we had surgery and post-injury and where you are now, so we can actually see like the whole cycle of changes of what you've gone through. And so I think from a physiology side, that's really exciting because it doesn't happen that often with a lot of athletes. So I think one of the big things is that we don't necessarily have to get 100% to where you were before, but we want to know that you're within a certain percentage, and that helps to give you confidence and validate that you are ready for the higher volume or higher intensities, or using your racing flats rather than just training shoes, and making those transitions. And we can look at the Stryds data and we can look at all the little different mechanics and begin to figure out, is that appropriate, is it not? Are you overreaching in something? Do we need to back down? And make sure that we're not causing that same injury or making the same mistakes that you may have made in the past.
Yep, and so what would be a sign of like overreaching? What would you look for in the data and say, oh no, like maybe that training load's too much, me back off? Like what would be a red flag?
Sure, so the simple answer, if you don't have a Stryds, right, we all look at like heart rate or pacing, right? Yep. So if you're doing 400 meter repeats and all of a sudden you're really far off your splits, you know that you probably have reached a limit. The nice thing with the Stryds is that we can actually see that metric happen before your perceived effort or your fatigue shows it. So when we've done some testing and assessments, we've been able to see the running mechanics change anywhere between 3 to 4 minutes before like a point of failure. And so it doesn't sound like a lot, but there's a lot of times in training we don't want to reach a full point of failure because you're just at a higher risk of injury. Yeah. So if we can look at some of those metrics, and one might just be something simple, it could be like a stride rate. which again, a lot of people have access to, so it's a good tool, but sometimes stride rate doesn't change. So then all of a sudden, okay, we think, what's next? Well, then I would say, how much is your vertical and horizontal power changing? So we know when we get more tired, we tend to be more springy, and you can see that with a lot of athletes, that they're bounding more, and so you're not using as much energy to move you forward. So we can look at that as a metric and say, okay, have we reached that threshold for the day? And if we have, great. Do we want to go past it, or we just want to go right up to it?
Do you think it's important to wear the Stryd and collect the data on every run? Or do you think just getting bits and pieces of the data is okay?
Yeah, so from my physiology background, the more data you can have, the better. So I think every time you can wear it, no matter what you're doing, it's great. But I know that's not the reality of every situation. I would say wear it as often as you can. So if we collect one data point, it's helpful. If we collect 7 data points, we start to see something. Now if we have 14 or 21 data points, we can see trends. So the more information you have, the better objective information or decision making you can make. But sometimes we forget, or we swap our shoes out and forget to transfer it from one shoe to the next. So again, I think as often as you can, but the nice thing with the Stryd is that you don't always have to connect it to a watch.
Right.
It'll collect data in the background. So you don't have to be paralyzed by all the analysis that's going on. So you can do your training session, go out and do whatever racing training, and come back and download the data. So you don't have to be staring at your watch of like, what's happening? Should I stop or should I not? And I think that's a really good tool or advantage of that system, is that do your training, you can download it, you don't even have to look at it, but know that when you have the data, if you need it, because you're trying to figure out what went really well, we want to know why it's going well. And on the same thing, if it's not going well, I want to have the data so we know, was there something, a definitive training session or a week or something in your training cycle that we can pinpoint and say, I think this is when that may have happened.
And what, like I have you, a sports scientist, to kind of analyze all this. What if somebody doesn't have that and they want to analyze their power and look for metrics? Is there an easy way for them to do that, or is there something you think they should look out for? I know we talked a little bit about like just changes in numbers and probably just looking at results over time, and then if there's any changes, is that kind of what they should be looking for?
Yeah, I think so. And the nice thing with the Stryd system is that when you purchase a Stryd, I'm not trying to sell it by any means, but when you purchase it, they have a Stryd Power Center. So when you download your data, they actually have really good tools to help you navigate that. So you don't have to be a sports scientist to know the data, but you can see your trends over time. So you can see if there's areas that you're improving in your speed or your endurance or your stamina, and you can actually say, okay, is my training focusing on that, and am I getting that adaptation? And I think that's really helpful. And also with any tool and technology, I think just the more you use it, the more you start to understand it as well. A lot of the big things, when I look at the data, I think, okay, let's start from a 30,000 foot perspective. Let's take big picture before we start getting into, how is this foot strike? So we've got to see the big trends over time, and then once we understand that, then we can start looking at the details. So it takes a little time, but it's also a fun part about sport.
Yeah, and there's like some of the little details that I've learned along the way are the surface you're running on can change that power data, the shoes you're wearing, and that stuff I found kind of interesting if you want to touch a little bit on how those sorts of things can change power or why they change power.
Sure, yeah. So the surface area that we run on, we all read that in books and magazines and blogs of run on a softer surface, right? Or if you're running on a treadmill, it helps to give you a little bit more cushion, or a running track versus concrete and asphalt. So we can actually see that change happen. So what we can see with the Stryd is that compression or that leg spring stiffness on how you're rebounding off the ground. And there's pros and cons to it all. I think the main messages that I see is that we don't want it to be all or none. So we don't want to be all on soft surfaces. We don't want to be always on a track. We don't always want to be on the concrete or asphalt. It's probably good to change it up a little bit. One that's just for tendon health in our feet, in our knees, and our hips, that giving a little bit of variety, because there's so much consistency in running on that springiness that it's just a lot of repetition. So adding a little bit of variety throughout your training week is actually really positive.
And is it true that like harder surfaces help with tendons and then softer surfaces kind of help prevent like bone issues?
It can be, yeah. I mean, I think if you're coming back from any type of injury, a soft surface is good, whether it's tendon or bone. And less impact is better. But there comes a point if we're trying to compete and be prepared for an event, we want to make sure we're also being as specific as possible. A harder surface, we often if you go out for a 5K or 10K road race and you haven't done that, your calves get really sore, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of it's because of the speed, but the harder surface and that turnover. So we want to make sure we're not experiencing that every time we race. So again, variety is good, but specificity as we get closer to our main goal might be more better for our overall performance.
And how does power change with like spikes versus trainers? Is it more the speed that makes the power change when you change over into like lighter shoes, or is there actually something with the different types of shoes that makes your power change?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and we all have our racing shoes or racing flats, but I think the main thing, it's similar to the road surface, is that our trainers tend to be a little bit more soft or compressed, and racing flats, whether they're for marathon or on the track, they're thinner, they're a little bit more stiff, and we can actually see that change happen. So we also want to not save our racing flats or shoes only for race day. We need to do a handful of sessions to be prepared for that too, and also know what those loads are so that we can then also better prepare in training. So that's another advantage of using a power meter, that we can say, okay, what are your overall loads? And what I mean by that is the power or the amount of stress that's placed on you during that race or training session, and how can we mimic that in a different scenario, whether it's using trainers on a road or trainers on a track or more intervals or running faster.
Awesome. But yeah, I mean, I have Lindsay, you look at my data, Bobby McGee looks at my data, and then Stryds also looks at my data. So there's a lot of people kind of working together, and it's been really helpful for me just coming back from injury and seeing my metrics pre-surgery and post-surgery, and I'm almost back to the exact same numbers when I was completely healthy, which is pretty exciting, and that kind of has given me confidence going into this altitude training camp, knowing that I can do the workouts.
Yeah, which is good. And I think it's important to have a few people looking at data, but not too many, right? It's that saying, like, too many cooks in the kitchen. Because if you have too many people, there's too many different ideas, but I think it is helpful to have a couple different people looking at it, because someone might catch something that I don't see, or vice versa. And then that can be really helpful as you continue on your training and race preparation.
I just want to thank Lindsay for her time today.
Thanks.
Hopefully you guys learned something about power. If you want to learn more about Stryds, you can check them out. I have a link in my bio.